Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for our latest Green Breakfast webinar. My name is Liam O'Flynn, and I'm a Senior Associate in the Energy, Waste and Sustainability team here at Freeths. I'm joined by two other members of the Energy, Waste and Sustainability team, Claire King, who heads up our practice, and Reese Ballett, who is an associate in our team. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, we specialise in a whole range of clean energy projects, so wind, solar, battery storage, but also heat networks, EV infrastructure, and energy from waste projects. Today's session is the first in a planned series of webinars on all things hydrogen, with the focus for today being very much on an introduction to hydrogen, how it's produced, what it's used for, and why it's gathering so much attention in the energy sector right now. We've got this session in for about 45 minutes, but we're not expecting to use that full slot, so there should be plenty of time for questions, and failing that, you can have part of your mornings back. As Tom mentioned, there is a Q&A function, so please put your questions in the bottom and we can pick through those at the end of the presentation. Separately, you can always contact one of Claire, Reese, or myself if you have questions following the session, and our contact details are on the Freeths website. So, hydrogen, what's all the buzz? Move to the next slide, please, Tom. As you all have no doubt heard in the past few years, the UK is positioning itself at the forefront of the drive to net zero. The UK was the first major economy in the world to legislate and commit to a binding target to reach net zero by 2050, with an intermediate target of reducing our emissions by 78% no later than 2035. The sheer size and scale of these targets is enormous and ambitious, and in order to help set out the roadmap to follow, the government has, in the past couple of years, published key documents like the Energy White Paper, the Net Zero Strategy, 10-point plan, and of particular interest for today's session, the Hydrogen Strategy. Now, these plans and strategies provide broad overviews of targets and initiatives to decarbonise every facet of our lives and the economy. While some of the themes, which we'll come back to later, are still at the early stages of understanding and development, there is one key message that shines through. We have to reduce, and in most cases stop, our dependency on fossil fuels such as coal, oil and natural gas. And in order to do this, we need to find alternative processes that are less carbon intensive and find and use low or non-carbon fuels and energy vectors such as hydrogen. So if we move to the next slide, please. At its core, hydrogen is seen as a like-for-like replacement for natural gas. Hydrogen is a highly flammable gas. It has more energy potential than fossil fuels. When it's burnt in oxygen, pure oxygen that is, the only byproduct is water, and it can be stored and transported in a number of ways, including at scale, in the same way that natural gas or liquid fossil fuels can be. On paper, hydrogen looks like a winner in our search for a low carbon fuel replacement, and it has potential to be used in a whole raft of industrial processes and across our economy as we look to decarbonise. It will be particularly useful in sectors where the cost of electrification is too high, and by some government estimates, they're expecting the global low carbon hydrogen economy to be worth nearly $1 trillion by 2050. So if you move to the next slide, please. Claire will look in more detail at some of the prospective uses of hydrogen shortly, but it's worth mentioning that using hydrogen is not actually a new thing. Since its discovery in 1776, hydrogen has played a role in our everyday lives, from helping to fertilise fields to providing part of the town gas that lit our streets and heated our homes into the 1960s. And today it's used in a wide range of chemical and industrial processes. Perhaps most famously, though, that historic hydrogen usage is associated with the Hindenburg airship disaster. So, I hear you ask, what's the catch? Well, there are two immediate issues. The first is that despite its history and its current uses in chemical refining, according to a 2021 report from the International Energy Agency, global demand for hydrogen and hydrogen-based products was around 90 million tonnes in 2020. At the same time, global demand for natural gas was almost 3 billion times higher. This simply highlights the scale of the challenge for the hydrogen sector to grow to help replace dependence on fossil fuels. We're at almost a standing start in terms of creating a market for hydrogen and the potential uses for it. I'll come back to this point a bit later when we consider what the government is doing to create and foster this market. The other issue is that there are almost no abundant natural sources of pure hydrogen, so it needs to be manufactured. and at significant scale. At which point I'll hand over to Reese, who'll talk a little bit more about what this means for low carbon hydrogen.
Thanks very much, Liam. Tom, if you can move on to the next slide, please. So like Liam was saying, hydrogen is the most abundant molecule in the universe, approximately 75% of its mass, but it's very rarely found in its pure form. Therefore, in order to produce pure hydrogen, it has to be separated from naturally occurring compounds. As was the case in my undergraduate degree in geography, the low carbon economy champions the use of colours when discovering different methods of hydrogen production. The colour wheel on the slide extrapolates the main colours which are present in the literature, but this list is constantly expanding. In the context of the UK's net zero transition, the three most important methods of production are blue, turquoise and green, as these are the colours which are badged low carbon. It's worth noting that hydrogen is already mass produced and used predominantly for industrial purposes. The main methods of production are grey, so this is steam methane reformation without carbon capture and storage, which I'll come on to later, and brown, so this is hydrogen produced from coal gasification. Next slide, please, Tom. So blue hydrogen is hydrogen which is produced from natural gas using a process called steam reformation. This process combines purified natural gas and steam in the presence of a catalyst, which is then condensed before CO2 is removed to create pure hydrogen gas. To be classified as blue, the CO2 which is produced as a byproduct has to be captured and compressed at the point of production, transported to a site for storage, and then injected into rock formations or similar deep underground. This process is called CCS. CCS is the subject of some skepticism in the industry for a number of reasons. For example, there are concerns around carbon leakage, where the CO2 stored underground inadvertently escapes. And as for now, CCS is a nascent technology. There are also concerns about the economic viability of blue hydrogen production due to the associated expense of storage. There are additional concerns surrounding blue hydrogen. Whilst it's currently the front runner for receipt of government funding under the net zero plan, there's growing consensus amongst industry experts that blue hydrogen will need to be phased out for green hydrogen in the long run. As an alternative to CCS, there's another term which is used, which is CCUS. The U here stands for utilization, and it just indicates that the CO2 created can be used in other processes, such as the manufacture of food and fizzy drinks. Next slide, please, Tom. Turquoise hydrogen is similar to blue hydrogen, but uses a method called methane pyrolysis. This involves heating methane with a catalyst to produce hydrogen gas, but whilst blue hydrogen produces gaseous CO2, methane pyrolysis produces solid carbon. This is useful because it can be used as an additive for steel, filler in car tires, graphite, dye, or soil conditioner. By eliminating the need for carbon capture and the associated expense, it's seen as a genuine competitor to blue hydrogen, but turquoise hydrogen production has not yet been proven at scale. Next slide, please, Tom. Green hydrogen is produced using electrolysis. This process involves using renewable or low carbon electricity to split water into its components of hydrogen and oxygen. There are many subcategories of green hydrogen, which has been used to differentiate between the generating assets used to produce the electricity for electrolysis. For example, pink hydrogen describes the process of creating hydrogen via electrolysis using electricity generated from nuclear energy. The main benefit of green hydrogen production over blue or turquoise is that there are no carbon byproducts from the process. However, green hydrogen is not without its issues. Chiefly, the production of hydrogen by electrolysis is very energy intensive, and as such, a significant amount of renewable energy would be required. The associated cost currently challenges the economic viability of large-scale green hydrogen production. Additionally, a great number of electrolyzers on the market require a stable delivery of electricity, which is somewhat incompatible with the technologies used, such as solar and wind. So they may need to be co-located with batteries, which then has a further cost implication. Onto Claire.
Okay, so moving on to the uses of hydrogen. So there are a few things you can do with it once you've produced it. As Liam and Reece already touched on, it's already used widely in industrial and chemical processes. I've listed a few there. Ammonia production is the one that really jumped out at me. It's used in a lot of fertilizers, but ammonia is also an important part of the decarbonisation journey, particularly in the context of shipping. So important there. Again, as we've touched on, hydrogen is sometimes viewed as a like-for-like replacement for methane, natural gas. And in a lot of equipment, it can be used in the existing infrastructure, so combustion engines, boilers and turbines to a certain extent, particularly if it's blended with methane. We'll come on to that in a second. More exciting from my perspective, though, is its use in fuel cells. And indulge me briefly here. I did a chemistry degree, and very rarely do I get to talk about this anymore. So on the right-hand side of the slide there, you'll see the process of a fuel cell. But essentially what you do is you stick in hydrogen on the left-hand side. You also need air, which comes in there from the right-hand side. It goes through an electrical process, but the byproduct is an electrical current, which you'll see the red arrows coming out the top. And importantly, the only byproduct is water and heat. Now, provided you've got a continuous input of fuel and oxygen, you will get a continuous output of heat and electricity. And in that respect, it's more reliable than, for example, lithium-ion batteries, which are getting a lot of attention because clearly they can only discharge the amount of electricity that they are charged with. Also, fuel cells are about 60% efficient, which means they are generally more efficient than combustion engines. So again, quite exciting from that perspective. And then finally, you can store it, and we'll come on the next slide to talk about why that is helpful. Next slide, please, Tom. Okay, so what is the application then of these things that you can do with hydrogen? Well, one of the most obvious is heating. There's a lot of talk about hydrogen as a replacement for natural gas in heating. Now, that using existing infrastructure, that is challenging because existing boilers in domestic properties will not necessarily cope with hydrogen gas, and certainly the gas grid as it currently exists would not cope with pure hydrogen gas. Hydrogen is I'm getting chemical again here, but bear with me. Hydrogen is a smaller molecule than methane, and therefore it escapes more readily. But also the metallurgy of the pipes is such that pure hydrogen would in fact be corrosive. So the long and short is you cannot stick pure hydrogen into the existing gas grid. What you can do, however, is blend it. And at the moment, there are some trials going on about where hydrogen would be blended up to 20% in the gas grid. And in fact, the government has spent about £25 million already on a programme called the High for Heat programme, which is looking at the potential of blended hydrogen in fact, they're looking at pure hydrogen in this particular trial, but there's also a trial called High Deploy, which is looking at blending hydrogen. Now, while these trials are going on, they're basically gathering evidence on the feasibility, cost, convenience, and consumer acceptability of these various different hydrogen applications in the context of heat. Depending on which is the winner, we could end up with replacement or replacement of existing gas boilers with hydrogen boilers. I think that's unlikely. We could end up with entirely new hydrogen gas pipe networks. Again, I think that's highly unlikely on a national scale, but perhaps on a localized scale. And then depending on the acceptability of blending, we could start to see that in the gas grid. But as I say, this is all at the very early stages. It's receiving government funding, which is fantastic. But at the moment, there isn't a front runner on how that is going to work. In an industrial context, though, hydrogen does potentially have a really important application in the short term. And that is because it can produce very high temperature heat, which is important for certain industrial processes, so particularly industrial furnaces, and that's important because at the moment electrification can't achieve the same sort of thing. So hydrogen is really an important decarbonisation tool in that context. So then moving on to transport, low carbon hydrogen is a really great alternative to petrol, diesel and kerosene, as it can be used directly in combustion engines, fuel cells and turbines. But in addition to that, it can also be used as a feedstock to produce low carbon transport fuel. So I mentioned ammonia already. The applications here are wide and varied. So road vehicles, one, and I'm sure lots of people will already have seen hydrogen buses on the road, particularly in London. And again, here it's important because the electrification of certain vehicle types is challenging because, for example, for HGVs, the size of the battery you would need to haul a heavy load over long distances basically is the same size as the load itself. So it doesn't exactly work. So hydrogen important there. Also important for non-road vehicles, so forklifts and diggers. This is something my sons would get excited about. And then rail, shipping, aviation, and even space exploration. So really hydrogen does have the potential to play a fundamental role in decarbonising the transport sector, which at the moment is the largest single contributor to UK domestic greenhouse gas emissions. Let's touch briefly on rail in particular. So electric trains have long been viewed as the most likely successor to the existing diesel fleet, but at the moment, large-scale rollout is hampered by the need to invest in expensive electrical rail infrastructure. The difference with hydrogen is that hydrogen-powered trains can run on the existing rail infrastructure, so clearly that is very appealing from that sector's perspective. And Siemens has actually developed a hydrogen train with a hydrogen drive system consisting of a fuel cell with a lithium-ion battery, and I believe that is already in testing in Germany. So really exciting times there. I'll touch briefly on power generation, but actually, as Rhys said, the amount of electricity you need to produce hydrogen means that using hydrogen as a means of then producing more electricity is not actually workable. However, it does have certain applications in power generation, as I've listed here on the slide, in backup power for buildings. So where you might have at the moment a gas-fired CHP engine sitting in the basement of the building for backup power supply, you could instead have a hydrogen-powered engine. Also use in uninterruptible power supply or UPS systems, where certain industries, particularly manufacturing, require a constant input of energy, and hydrogen can do that, as I touched on in the previous slide. Provided you've got a constant input of hydrogen and oxygen, you can have a constant output from a fuel cell at the other end. And then, of course, it can, in theory, be used in combined heat and power systems where you currently would use natural gas. And then on the previous slide, I touched on storage, and here's where it's interesting from an electricity system perspective. It's essentially a tool for storing electricity. And the classic example I always give is, what happens if it's very windy at 3 o'clock in the morning and all the offshore wind farms are generating, but nobody's using that electricity. At the moment, what happens is National Grid tells the wind turbines to switch off. They pay them to switch off, or the electricity gets stored through pumped hydro storage and things like that, pumping water up a hill and storing in a reservoir. However, we don't have enough storage capacity at the moment. So hydrogen has a really interesting part to play here, potentially, where you would convert the excess electricity generated at 3 a.m. You would electrolyze it, so you convert it into hydrogen, store it in tanks. Then you could either use it for something, so use it in industrial processes or to manufacture transport fuels, etc. Or you could, in theory, electrify it or re-electrify it when the electricity is needed. So typically that would be a weekday between 4 and 7 p.m. And with the electricity price volatility that we're currently seeing, actually that's quite an exciting prospect. Next slide, please, Tom. So just finally from me, I thought it was worth touching on the distribution of hydrogen. So I mentioned pipelines and the fact that the existing gas grid couldn't cope with pure hydrogen, but could cope with blended hydrogen. I also touched on the potential for new hydrogen networks. Now, obviously, it's completely unfeasible to expect the entire country to have a hydrogen network, but there could certainly be localized hydrogen networks, particularly where you might have hydrogen production co-located with industrial processes, co-located with carbon capture and storage, etc. There's also talk in the UK hydrogen strategy of interconnectors. So these would essentially be subsea pipelines connecting the UK or GB with other hydrogen gas markets. I think we're a long way off that, but it is a possibility. Then there's also non-pipeline transportation of hydrogen. So as you might imagine, that's road, rail, and marine transport. And you can do that either in hydrogen in its gaseous form, in a compressed form, or you can liquefy it, and that requires supercooling, cryogenic transport. But generally, because hydrogen is actually, although it's explosive, it is a relatively stable gas, so it is suitable for large-scale, long-duration storage in a gaseous form. It can also be stored in a solid form, but that's not quite so widespread at the moment. There's plenty of research and development going into that at the moment. And then listed there are some of the storage methods. Of course, you've got the specialist tanks and storage vessels. They can be stationary, large, gas tanks, or they could be mobile, moving around, which is, again, has interesting applications. But similar to the carbon capture and storage that Reece described earlier, there are existing natural formations that could act as a hydrogen storage. So lots of exciting potential there. That's it from me. I will hand back to Liam.
Super, thanks very much, Claire. So if we move to the next slide, please, Tom. So we've looked at how we can produce low carbon hydrogen, and we've looked at what that hydrogen could be used for. And it's clear that there's potentially a huge market for it. But I want to be very clear on one point. No one's suggesting that hydrogen is going to be the sole solution, but the government is projecting that hydrogen will represent somewhere between 20 and 35% of the UK's total energy consumption in 2050, with much of that ramp up happening in the decades following the 2020s. As I touched upon earlier, though, there are some significant challenges that need to be overcome in order to get to that point, though. So if we move to the next slide, please. So the first of these is cost, and the table on the screen shows a cost comparison of hydrogen versus natural gas. I've included 3 costs of natural gas, one for last week, one for a direct comparison with the hydrogen figures, and one for the pre-COVID era. Now, the pre-COVID cost is probably the most interesting, as it shows just how big the cost differential is between natural gas and hydrogen before the pandemic and before the crisis in Ukraine. To put it another way, it's taken a once-in-a-century global pandemic and a once-in-a-generation war impacting the global economy to see wholesale hydrogen prices become cost competitive with wholesale gas prices. We're still only talking about grey and blue hydrogen at that point. There's still a premium attached to producing green hydrogen, primarily because of the added costs that go into creating it, like the cost of installing and running an electrolyzer and the cost of building out renewable energy plants as well. Now, obviously, these numbers don't tell the whole story, and we've discussed already that the UK's hydrogen journey is still in its infancy. So the expectation is that cost competitiveness of low carbon hydrogen, and particularly green hydrogen, will happen as the market matures. The point of the table is to highlight that for hydrogen to become a like-for-like replacement for natural gas, as some commentators would have you believe, it will eventually need to reach the same cost as it and then beat it on a consistent basis, which, as you can see from the bar chart, is not 100% certain this far out from 2050. How this will be achieved is through a number of factors, some of which we'll look at shortly. The second major barrier to the hydrogen market is regulation. Now, naturally, as a lawyer, I would say that, but how the new hydrogen economy is regulated is going to be key. In certain sectors, there are already some pieces of legislation that can provide gateways. So, for example, there are clear parallels with the current gas industry, and important pieces of legislation like the Gas Act already make allowances for hydrogen to be used in the gas grid. But this is only the beginning of that regulation piece. And to truly unleash hydrogen's cross-sector potential, more will need to be done to ensure hydrogen is safely used across the UK economy. Now, there are a lot of pieces still to be figured out in terms of the hydrogen economy and what it will all look like in 2030 and 2050. The government is looking at 10 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen production by 2030 and an intermediate step of 2 gigs in operation or construction by 2055. However, in December 2020, there was only 10 megawatts of low carbon hydrogen production in the UK. And whilst cornerstone projects, mostly led by the likes of ITM Power, should see us hit that 2025 target, without further support on the regulatory side and in making the hydrogen industry a commercially viable alternative to fossil fuels, it's really quite hard to see how we get from where we are today to where we need to be in 2030 to 2050. Now, that's not to sound overly pessimistic about the role of hydrogen in reaching net zero. If all the ambition and proposed policies set out in the government's recent strategies are met, then we'll be on the right path to meet those ambitions. It's just a very big if, but not one without hope. We're still making the first steps in the industry and starting to understand how hydrogen can be used to get us to where we need to be. Simply understanding the sheer scale of what is being asked has to be the starting point, after which we have to consider how we get from where we are now to net zero in 2050. What that inevitably means is a lot of planning, research, and consultation on developing the market, putting financial incentives in place, and boosting production. And what that translates to is a significant amount of thinking time rather than immediate delivery of hydrogen at scale. So if we move to the next slide, please, Tom. So this slide is taken from the government's hydrogen investor roadmap from April this year. As you can see, there is a lot that is expected to happen in the next decade, but broadly, there are 3 major themes to developing the hydrogen economy. How do we get people to invest in hydrogen projects? How do we provide certainty that investors will succeed? And how can we be sure that those investments drive us towards net zero? Now, helpfully, alongside the release of the hydrogen strategy last year, the government launched consultations addressing these points. And the feedback has started coming through in the last few months around the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund, hydrogen business model, and the low carbon hydrogen standard. These are essentially the cornerstone consultations to the development of a working low carbon hydrogen economy. So it's worth spending a little bit of time looking at these, starting with the Net Zero Hydrogen Fund. So if we move to the next slide, please, Tom. So the fund has been established to support at-scale deployment of low-carbon hydrogen production during the 2020s, with 3 core aims: stimulating low-carbon hydrogen production by supporting upfront costs, leveraging private sector investment, and creating high-skilled green jobs; bringing down the costs and risks associated with hydrogen by demonstrating commercial uses of the technologies; and also stimulating a future pipeline of projects. In order to do this, the government has set aside £240 million in the fund, with the first awards expected out at the end of this year. That funding is supported by 26 million set aside for innovation funding and another 100 million set aside for developing electrolytic projects through the business model. The fund is then further split down into different strands, as they call them, that may benefit from the funding, so covering various points in time through the early stage development of the project in order to make sure that it can get off the ground as intended. So as you can see there, we've got development expenditure, and then we've got CapEx for three different pockets. One for projects that fall outside of the hydrogen business model, one for CapEx on electrolytic projects, which is principally green hydrogen projects, and also CapEx for blue hydrogen projects. Now, overall, the fund is designed to provide a jump start, but on a twin track approach that the government is keen on. The twin track approach tries to provide an even playing field to all forms of low carbon hydrogen production, as the government cannot accurately predict what will be the long-term solution to providing low carbon hydrogen, whether that's blue or green or something else entirely that we're not sure of just yet. So if we move to the next slide, please. The fund is also linked to the hydrogen business model. In order to help facilitate the new hydrogen economy, some of the key barriers to entry also need to be dealt with. Now, we've already dealt with or discussed cost competitiveness and regulation, but there are other concerns around technology, commercial business models, demand uncertainty, and a lack of infrastructure. In order to help combat these, the government looked at potential business models that could help facilitate the growth of the industry and to ensure that investors in the industry are set up to succeed. Somewhat unsurprisingly, you might say, given the success of the offshore wind industry, the government has plumped for a contract for difference, or CFD model. In short, the model provides that hydrogen producers will have certainty they will receive a set price for their product, regardless of whether the wider hydrogen market price is lower. As the graph sets out, though, the corollary of this is that where the market outperforms the strike price, the producer makes a balancing payment back to the counterparty. Can we move to the next slide, please? So we've looked at getting people into the industry, and we've looked at providing them with a long-term revenue stream so that they have cash flow certainty and can potentially speak to financial institutions to debt finance bigger, better projects. But how do we know that the hydrogen being produced is blue or green and not grey or brown? Well, the low carbon hydrogen standard consultation looked to do just that. It helped to define the maximum level of greenhouse gas emissions acceptable in producing hydrogen, so that it could be labelled low carbon hydrogen. And whilst the threshold has been set through the feedback from that consultation, the government isn't ruling out that could change over the time, whether that's an increase to the threshold or more likely a decrease to move us closer to green hydrogen projects. All options are open at this stage. The standard itself will form part of the basis by which companies look to benefit from the fund and the business model, and how they'll be assessed. If you're not looking to produce low carbon hydrogen, you can't get the funding and you can't be awarded a low carbon hydrogen CFD. The standard itself is only designed for production, and it isn't intended to impact on other standards of hydrogen that might be required, for example, in transmission or storage, or the various potential uses of hydrogen that Claire touched on earlier. The standards that apply to each of those sectors will likely talk to the low carbon hydrogen standard, but they may well have additional features such as certain purity levels or pressure specifications. Now, once adopted, the standard would be supported by a certificate scheme, which is targeted for around 2025, where all purchasers will have additional security that the hydrogen they are purchasing is green or blue. The expectation is that that certificate scheme would have similarities with ROCs or emissions trading certificates, so that there's the potential for creating a secondary market for low carbon hydrogen certificates. Now, as I mentioned, these are three of the cornerstone issues for the market, but I don't want you to come away from the session thinking that's the only stuff that's going on with hydrogen at the moment. So if we move to the next slide. So we touched on some of these extra developments already. So in the heating sector, there's there's various pilots going on around how hydrogen can be used in buildings, and there are important milestones in the next couple of years before a final decision about the viability of hydrogen for heat is likely to be made in sort of mid to late 2026. In the transport sector, government is looking at how we move hydrogen around the country, with decisions expected on that in late 2024. The government is also expected to make a decision on whether to mandate all HGVs to run on hydrogen mid-decade, and has set aside around £20 million for a programme looking at delivering hydrogen refuelling stations. And in the infrastructure sector, linked to the possibility of using existing pipelines, either in whole or in part for transmission, government is looking at how hydrogen can be stored, and recently made awards out of its £60 million hydrogen supply 2 competition and its £68 million longer duration energy storage demonstration competition, which is quite a mouthful. So if we move to the next slide, please, Tom. So to bring us full circle, hydrogen, what's all the buzz? Well, the short answer is the buzz around hydrogen is palpable. It can answer a large number of concerns that people have regarding decarbonisation and the race to net zero. it could be used in a whole range of industries. But in order to get to that point, a lot needs to happen in a short space of time. There's a mantra in government and a lot of commentators saying we won't know whether we're going to hit net zero in 2050 if we don't know where we're going to be at 2030. And 2030 is really the marker for a lot of decarbonisation issues, and in particular hydrogen. We need to get to a position where we can see the progress of the last 8 years in 2030 to forecast where we're going to be in 2050. Clearly, the government's got its work cut out to deliver on all of that ambition, but it is making a start on it. But the real buzz around hydrogen is that there's a new industry being created right before our eyes, one that, if all goes well, provides ample opportunity to revolutionise every facet of the global economy and help us reach that fabled target of net zero in 2050. So that concludes our presentations. We've had a few questions come through from the Q&A, so we can pick up who's up now in the short time that we've got left. And if anyone has any other questions, then please feel free to put those in the chat box. So the first question that's come in is, when is it expected that hydrogen will be available for use in domestic heating or car fuel? Let's go with Reese. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, if we take hydrogen cars first, the first point to make is that hydrogen fuel cars already exist. There are currently 2 hydrogen powered cars which are available for sale on the UK market, the Toyota Mirai and the Hyundai Nexo. The main issue which prevents further adoption is the lack of refueling stations. There are currently only 14 nationwide. An additional concern for the expansion of the hydrogen car market would be the fact that the EV market, electric vehicle market that is significantly more mature now. It's likely, I think we touched on this earlier, I think Claire spoke about it, that hydrogen might have more success with heavier vehicles, for instance, buses and HGVs, just because the size of the battery which would be required to fuel a larger vehicle like that would make the vehicle a lot heavier. And therefore a lighter hydrogen fuel cell might have more success.
I think we're going to see a lot of hydrogen application in sort of depot centralized vehicles as well, where you could have a depot co-located with hydrogen production, or at least with hydrogen storage, so that vehicles returning to the depot could easily refuel, and that obviously overcomes the issue we currently have with a lack of hydrogen refueling infrastructure.
And to come on to the second strand of that question, which was hydrogen for heating, I think as Liam briefly touched upon, that there are trials taking place currently to see whether it's viable to roll out the use of pure hydrogen for heating homes. These are going to be conducted from 2023 to 2025 at various scales. The key date for a government decision on whether they would shoot for a pure hydrogen rollout or whether it would be blending would be, or not at all for that instance, would be 2026. And I think, again, as we touched upon, the main issue associated with using pure hydrogen would be the need to replace existing gas infrastructure and indeed all internal appliances to be, quote, hydrogen ready. The expense associated with that could make it unviable. So I think in that instance, the question is, well, it may not be when, but if the government decides to go with it. Personally, I think that it's ambitious, and that because of the cost, it's unlikely. But we'll see where we land.
We should also recommend our previous webinar on the decarbonisation of heating, if that's of particular interest to whoever asked the question, or others more widely.
Yes, and just on that point, I can see from our chat we've had a couple of references to the cost comparison of what hydrogen is doing at the moment versus electrification of vehicles, electric heat pumps, and how do we get to the 25 to 35% of energy consumption being hydrogen in 2050. As I said earlier on, no one's saying that hydrogen is the panacea. A lot of commentary is out there that makes it seem like that, and particularly commentators who are saying it's a like replacement for natural gas. you know, the market is so immature at the moment that yes, there are better alternatives now. It's just sort of a bit of an unknown quantity as to what's going to happen in the next 10, 15 years with each one of those technologies that I mentioned. So, electrify everything or hydrogenize everything. There's also the possibility that a new technology comes out in the next 10, 15 years that outstrips all of these things. It's just sort of recognizing at this stage that whilst hydrogen is potentially prohibitively more expensive, we're not going to know what impact it's going to have on our net zero journey until we get to 2030. So it's very much an interesting space to be in, but one that's quite watch and see for a little bit. We've had some other questions come in. Claire, one that I think came in as a result of what you were talking about in terms of the trucks, and I think Reese has touched upon it slightly, is that the bottleneck for battery electric long haul trucks is less a physical constraint, but more around cell and raw material supply. What are your thoughts on that? And how does the use of hydrogen expand into beyond personal vehicles into those larger transport sectors?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, at the moment, it's a physical constraint issue, but I agree. Battery technology is moving on a pace, and batteries are getting smaller and lighter. But there is, whoever asked the question is absolutely right. There's a huge amount of demand for batteries and the constituent parts of batteries at the moment: lithium, cobalt, iron, etc. Yeah, there's going to be a huge amount of competition in that market. So I think hydrogen has a potentially important role to play there, provided we can get around the production and distribution issues that we have at the moment, in that there is an almost entirely a complete lack of distribution infrastructure in the UK at the moment. But as I say, there's plenty of government funding going. Well, there's never enough, is there? There's never enough funding. There is some government funding going into this. And it's an absolutely huge challenge. There is no clear winner yet in terms of how the hydrogen market is going to develop, what the main application is going to be, how it's going to be produced, where it's going to get from how it's going to get from production to demand, etc. But I think what is clear is that it does have an important role to play, not necessarily in all the uses that we've discussed on this webinar, but in at least some of them.
Super. Well, I'm conscious of time. Having said that, we wouldn't use up the 45 minutes. We're bang on the 45 minutes, and I'm aware there are a few more questions floating around. So if we've not got to your questions, then we will try to follow up separately and provide some thoughts or comments on those outstanding questions. And likewise, as I said at the start, if anything else jumps out in the interim, then please feel free to send them through. That just leaves me to say thank you to our speakers, Claire and Reese, and thank you to all of you who have joined us today. As I mentioned at the start, this is the first in our hydrogen webinar series. The next one is scheduled for after the school summer holidays and will focus on the role of hydrogen in the transport sector. More details will follow over the summer, but until then, thank you very much for joining and have a good day.